For folks join late too. Maybe just give one extra minute before I kick off. I know a number of folks signed up to see this async as well. So maybe just a disclaimer in the beginning here for all the folks joining live. There's also a number of folks joining async, and this will be this recorded webinar will be provided after the fact as well. So we can send that around as soon as we're done here. All right. All right, so I think I'm just going to kick off here. We don't have all the time in the world, only have about 45 minutes. So for those that were very punctual in joining this webinar, thank you so much for joining. Thanks so much for joining Novata's webinar on Singapore sustainability trends. We will be discussing carbon reporting in Singapore and Asia Pacific more broadly. My name is Kyle Flick, and I lead Novata's Asia Pacific business based out of Singapore. And luckily, I'm joined today by Roz Bazani out of Antler. So wanted to pass it to Roz to give a quick intro about herself.
Sure, I'll be very quick, Kyle. Thank you for having me today. So, hi everyone, I'm Roz Bazani. I'm partner and head of ESG and impact at Antler. So, Antler is one of the world's most active early stage investors. We started here in Singapore, made our first investment in 2018. We're now in 28 locations across 6 continents around the world. We invest from pre-seed up to Series C, and we're sector agnostic. So, looking forward to the discussion ahead.
Amazing. Thanks, Roz. And for folks listening, what I think is so great about Roz, and I'm sure you'll pick up on this soon, is she's incredibly good at making very complex topics very approachable. And she's incredibly pragmatic with how she talks about this topic. And it's very refreshing, I feel like. There's a lot of noise happening globally around carbon emissions and climate reporting more generally. So I think you'll find this discussion very refreshing. And also it's Monday at 5 p.m. in Singapore, right? So we don't want to bore you with slides for the next 45 minutes. We want to have this be really just an open discussion. And so as you have questions that come up, you hear something we say that you agree or disagree with, feel free to drop a question in the chat and we'll try to answer them as we go along. But also we will have about 10 minutes towards the end of this for Q&A if there is Q&A. Okay, great. So just in terms of agenda, like the title says, we're going to be looking at sustainability trends in Singapore. I think everyone's pretty familiar with the specific carbon reporting requirements, but we'll touch on that if you're unfamiliar about those requirements here locally in Singapore. We'll talk about the implementation approaches, and then we'll talk about general best practices, case studies, and other support if this is something you're looking to do. I think the big takeaway I want folks to walk away from today with is typically folks think of carbon reporting as compliance. And while I hate to say value creation, I think there really is a business case for tracking carbon emissions and skating to where the puck is going. And that's really what we're going to focus our time on today. So I think this should have given enough time for folks to join. So before we start the discussion, wanted to put a quick poll question up to get a sense check on where folks are in their carbon reporting and sustainability journey. So if you're here and can just drop in a line, this will help inform us and how to shape the conversation towards your specific needs. All right. Progressing, not yet started. Okay. Awesome. Sort of what I expected, which is great. So some early stage, some have been doing it for a little bit. That sounds great. So just in terms of key talking points, we talked about agenda, want to talk about corporate carbon reporting generally. Again, talking about beyond compliance, people think of this as a regulatory requirement. How is this going to be good for your business really is what we want to get across. Now with that, I'm going to take down the slides and we're going to kick off here. Okay. Um, Roz, so I'm gonna give this first question to you. We're gonna start very high level. And that question is, how has corporate carbon reporting evolved globally? And then where do you think Asia Pacific stands right now?
Yeah, great question to start with. I think when anyone hears carbon reporting, the first thing that they're going to think about is regulation. It's going to feel like a massive compliance burden. It's going to probably feel like there's going to be a cost somewhere, or maybe it's just thought of as an impossible task. But as Kyle was talking about, what we wanted to do was just be very clear up front. This isn't just about regulation. It's fundamentally about business success. And I think this is something that seems to have been forgotten about in all of these discussions. But we also know that regulation can drive change and it can provide some structure. So it's important that we do start there and just think about where we are today when it comes to carbon disclosures and sustainable finance just generally. So let's do a quick kind of whistle stop tour around the world. So in the US, let's start there. The SEC disclosure rules we know have faced a lot of challenges. There's been a lot of uncertainty. There's been a lot of flip-flopping back and forth. We saw corporates basically estimating that the ruling would cost them about $750,000 in their first year of reporting, and then $250,000 annually thereafter. And then, of course, enter the new administration, and we know that the SEC will no longer be pursuing this. But the important point to make is that although this is the case, there are still a lot of US companies that are going to voluntarily do carbon reporting going forward. And this is because a lot of the reasons are around market pressures, investor pressures, and we're going to dive into this in a little bit more detail later. Now, if we look elsewhere around the world, it's a bit of a kind of mixed bag. Europe is definitely grappling with over-regulation. After we saw the initial enforcement of disclosures, there was a lot of overlapping requirements, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of acronyms being flown around. And now with the omnibus package, which I think, what's the date today? So in 2 days, they'll be publishing this package, which was aimed to essentially streamline and simplify sustainability reporting requirements because they recognized there was a lot of regulatory complexity and competitiveness. So we don't know what the exact details are going to be, but I think what is clear is that the scope 1, 2, and 3 emission reporting is not going to go away. It just may look slightly different in terms of thresholds and who it's going to focus on first. So now while we think about US and Europe, they're sorting things out, really. APAC, I think, is a really fascinating picture. So we know, and definitely headlines are reporting fragmented regulations, enforcement challenges. There is still a lot of positive momentum that's building. And the first thing is the adoption of ISSB standard. So that's the International Sustainability Standards Board. This was put together back in 2021, I think it was. And their aim was to really sort of set global standards for sustainability reporting. And in APAC, it's really important because it's able to promote comparability and transparency. We've seen Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, all either integrating the ISSB standards into their regulatory frameworks or they're aligning their reporting standards to them. We've seen China and India developing their own sustainability disclosure standards, but all of them are going to be drawing on the ISSB standards. So there will be some alignment there. And I think overall now in APAC, 13 jurisdictions have either adopted or released exposure drafts of regulations aligned with the ISSB standards. And that's really significant. And then the second thing, which is sort of driving some momentum, is around the green and transition finance, which is definitely gaining credibility in the region. So the implementation of the Singapore Asia taxonomy, which was launched back in December 2023, it was one of the first taxonomies globally to actually include the concept of a transition category. We're also seeing MAS and HKMA kind of vying to be the Asia Sustainable Finance hubs, which in itself is quite exciting that they're willing to publicly state this is their intention and their commitment. Now, also, if we think about net zero commitments being set or targets being set by governments around APAC, this is becoming more common. We're seeing governments put it in legislation. We're seeing policy ambitions being spoken about publicly. Japan just came out with a revived target to reduce their emissions by 73% by 2040, which is an incredible ambition to have in itself. Then we look at carbon markets, pricing mechanisms, and how that's developing. We've got infrastructure platforms actually being set up to help enable this, to drive capital to this region. We're seeing, Singapore next year going to be pricing carbon at $45 per ton. This is sending a really strong signal to the market. And then, of course, renewable energy milestones. If you think about the progress that has been made across key markets in APAC, I don't think that's really being talked about often enough. China, which is considered the bad boy of emissions, they beat their solar and wind 2030 target by 6 years. Japan launched the first sovereign climate bond. India has the world's biggest solar farm. The IEA is even setting up an office here in Singapore or has set up, I think, actually, to help with more kind of localized pathways, thinking about risk scenarios that make sense for APAC and thinking about how we can develop our policy going forward. So all of these things really signal not just a commitment, but a massive opportunity for APAC.
Love that. That was so much good content. And just on that point, I think you broke down nearly every country in Asia. I think what is unbelievable about this is not only is Asia responsible for 50% of the world's GDP and 50% of global emissions, which gets talked about, I think, quite a bit. I don't think the speed at which this implementation has occurred gets enough credit. And what I mean by that, to your point, is the speed at which these carbon markets have developed, the speed at which this infrastructure is getting stood up, the speed at which carbon taxes, for example, have been implemented.
Yeah.
And you look at India and the ESG reporting requirements now covering their 1,000 top listed companies, right? Like that speed, it took, you kind of look at what happened in Europe, it took, right, a good 15 years to really have everything come together. And I think what we've seen in Asia is a real desire to do it the right way. And it's been really encouraging, I think. So I would just point out, I think, for folks listening, the speed and the commitment for which this is happening. And right, I think we touched on Australia, but like ASB, S1 and S2 being implemented this year as well, I think is a really important point. And so I think the speed is the one thing. I also think the scale perspective. So when you're looking at Asia and it sort of gets talked about as this global manufacturing hub, it's showing that it's basically lowering its emissions and beating the targets that they're setting. You had mentioned the Chinese being ahead of their targets as well. And the scale at which they're investing in renewable energy, I think, is just unbelievable. And so I've personally just learned, I feel like, a ton, I would say, the past few months. But I think the commitment and the speed has really taken me aback as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this is sort of, really thinking about, well, why is this happening? Like, it isn't the regulation driving the speed of change. It's really recognizing that there isn't much of a choice. To your point, Asia accounts for 50% of global carbon emissions. We're facing a massive GDP risk from nature loss, which is associated with climate change. We have half the world's population here, and we have some of the fastest growing economies. We also know that our energy demands are increasing, and they're going to keep increasing. So if we think about, current trends, so if we look at sort of a scenario of 2.5 degrees, right? Then Asia could lose about 20% of its GDP by 2048 due to climate change. If we look at ASEAN, then we're talking about 29%. That's massive. So we need all these different component parts. which includes regulation, which includes understanding, which includes disclosures, to actually drive this change and to be able to ensure that these losses and these risks are mitigated. So I think that APAC really recognizes that the economic risks and opportunities in transitioning faster is going to be necessary because we've got direct climate threats. We're highly dependent on export-driven industries. So this isn't about a political debate. It's simply about protecting our economies and actually securing a competitive edge through transition finance and not just green finance. Yes, we've got a lot of hurdles, like we talked about, enforcement of regulation, data gaps, greenwashing, insufficient incentives and penalties. And we're still very much reliant on fossil fuels, which of course are connected to jobs and to our financial systems. But despite all of this, everyone's looking to the West and looking at US and talking about Europe. But APAC is actually just advancing climate policy with very much this kind of business first, market driven mindset. And we're integrating it into industrial policy rather than treating it as a separate discussion point or kind of concern. And so I think what we've seen is definitely investors have noticed and companies really need to pay attention to.
Yeah. No, I think you're 100% right. It's real economic risk, and the conversation is refreshingly pragmatic, unlike other areas of the world, I think, like you mentioned. So I think that's this is actually a really good transition point too. I think that's a really good overview of the global landscape. We touched a lot on regulations, but then we also said, this really isn't just a regulatory issue. So why is this not just a regulatory issue? And what are some ways in which it actually, to your point, at a macro level, we understand how it can lead to GDP loss, but at the business level, why does it matter for folks to start caring about this?
I think it's a great question. And I think that sort of economic risk is so important to link back to it. I think understanding how it's affecting national priorities and how that will then filter down to company risk and requirements is really important to consider. But I think also what we need to really address is a lot of those kind of misconceptions around carbon reporting and how that kind of lends itself to thinking about why we should actually be doing this as a company, because every company has quite a unique product or objective. And it's very kind of context driven. So I think it's important to understand sort of what carbon reporting is actually kind of all about, which then just gives you the right kind of context for how we think about it. And I think this is also going to touch on a little bit of, I know one of your questions you had was why people shouldn't kind of wait to report, but I think it's so linked up with why this isn't a regulatory issue, what the misconceptions are, and why you shouldn't wait. So I'm going to try and sort of lump it up together, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So from my experience, and we've invested in over 1,500 portfolio companies around the world. There are some really common misconceptions from founders, and I would also say from our investment teams as well around carbon reporting. So one is that it's only about measuring carbon dioxide. We need to be more clear that this is about carbon equivalents, and it's a broader set of GHG emissions. The second thing is that it's too costly and time consuming. And so maybe Carl, I'll leave that one for you to address. And then a lot of people think it's simply a one-time compliance exercise. And again, this goes back to this point we made at the beginning, that people think that carbon reporting is solely a regulatory checkbox, rather than what it is, which is really, it's really a tool for risk management, for operational efficiency, and market positioning. And this entire sort of discussion is back to that sort of economic shift where carbon reporting is going to be embedded in how businesses raise capital, how they manage supply chains, and how they compete globally. And then I would say there's one more misconception, and that's the view that carbon accounting or carbon reporting equals climate risk. And that's not entirely true, but they are connected. So climate risk is a much broader concept. So we're incorporating issues like water scarcity, biodiversity loss, access to renewables, geographic vulnerabilities, energy grid stability, and the list kind of goes on and on. But carbon emissions are the kind of the common thread that's running through all of these challenges or business risks. So by understanding your emissions, you can gain really valuable insights, or let's just call it, business intelligence into your vulnerabilities and opportunities. So companies that measure emissions can really kind of create some serious advantages. So they can think about energy efficiency and cost reductions there. They can increase sort of investor and buyer or customer confidence. They can lower their capital costs. They can improve valuations. They can access new markets, or what we're seeing more of, particularly in APAC, access capital through sustainable finance, which, if we think about all of the banks out here in APAC, they have all publicly stated incredibly ambitious targets to grow their sustainable finance books. So if we just think about that for a second, like let's just do an example of, say, a manufacturing company. They need a loan of 30 mil, right? They want to invest in amazing new technology. So they go to the bank and they're offered 15 bips discount on their loan if they meet a few sustainability terms like waste and carbon emission reduction. So if they meet their targets, they create an annual saving of 45K. And then that means the company saves $225,000 over 5 years by simply achieving sustainability targets. And you think that sounds great. Okay, cool. They can put the capital to use, but there's more to it than just that. They're also saving from operational efficiencies. They've created lower energy costs. They've reduced waste disposal fees. Maybe they've even created a competitive advantage, where their customers really like to have aligned sustainability values with the companies I work with. Then you've got another example where maybe a startup is looking to sell their product to an enterprise customer. That enterprise customer falls within scope of CSRD, a regulation in Europe that requires them to report on their scope 3 emissions. So that includes all of their supply chain. And so this enterprise customer, maybe they're looking at 2 startups, but during the procurement process, there's one startup that is able to provide this information. They're able to sail through, they start generating revenue. They've been onboarded. That's awesome. The other startup goes, sorry, I haven't got that. Let me take a month. I'll come back to you. I need to figure out how to do this. Like when you're a startup and there's any delay or bottleneck in onboarding, that could be a difference between survival or not. And we know that enterprises are already requiring scope 3 data from suppliers. Investors are already assessing carbon risk across portfolios. So even if a company is not mandated to report today, your customers and your investors probably are. So, maybe I'll just pause there and see if there's anything to add, Kyle.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I don't feel like it gets talked about enough. I feel like people say, oh, you can create operational efficiency, but what does it actually mean? Well, it means that you can save $225,000 on interest expense over 4 years directly, right? Like that is a real cost that companies can save on. If I think an interesting example is when you track emissions and you look at your scope 3, you can identify logistics patterns or other bottlenecks to your point of where you're using a lot of emissions. And if you look at that and you can say, hey, we want to streamline this part of our supply chain, and emissions profile is actually a way to point out like where a hotspot is, to say, actually, we're spending too much money here, right? Like emissions is very much tied to energy usage and costs, right? So I think that's a really interesting piece. And then back to the cost of capital, I think CDP a stat here is that, I think CDP reports that companies with strong emissions tracking and lower emissions have 5 to 15% lower cost of capital on average. So if you're, raising capital, that's important. If you're raising money from investors, obviously folks get LP requests all the time, and that matters. But then also, if you're going for a contract with a government, with a large company, with a listed company on the SGX as of this year, those companies in their supply chain will be asking, those listed companies on the supply, those listed companies will be asking the companies in their supply chain for their carbon emissions because they fall into scope 3. And so that's happening now, right? And like we talked to folks the other week where they're scrambling to try and get this together because they don't want to lose this contract. And like, again, you could say it's the cost of doing business. You could say this is compliance. You can say whatever. At the end of the day, these are real costs and real opportunities that companies here locally are facing.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, everyone gets so excited about data centers. And when you think about them, they're the perfect example to be talking about energy efficiency and cost to OPEX. So if you think about if they are able, compared to sort of more traditional data centers, right? If they're implementing more efficient systems and they can cut energy consumption by up to 40%. And when you know that energy is representing what, like 30 to 60% of OPEX, that saving is massive. So even if you kind of think as a company, like maybe we'll adopt the data center mindset. Like, how do we make ourselves more efficient? How do we save more money? Then that in itself is a great shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's tough though, because you have, I think what, the examples we mentioned, right, were manufacturing, logistics, you have these like supply chains. There's a lot going on. I think, and I would even say too, even folks in oil and gas, we have a number of clients in that space as well. Everyone is eyes wide open on how things are changing, right? They understand that's important to track emissions. They understand it's important to streamline. What if I'm a early stage tech company? What if I am a 5-person consulting firm that works out of Justco down the street, right? Like, why is this important for smaller and or other industries, I guess, smaller companies?
Yeah. Maybe I'm going to take you back to sort of my intro, because I'm sure when I said to people, we invest from pre-seed to Series C, people went, why on earth have they invited Roz to talk about carbon reporting? This makes no sense. None of our companies are going to be doing this. But we have to remind ourselves that we are living in such an incredibly complex and evolving landscape when it comes to climate risk. And it is one certainty that we can count on, both from a physical and transitional sort of perspective in terms of risk. I mean, if we start like diving into more of the science-based theories about sort of, tipping points or planetary boundaries, and I'll probably kind of lose people, but it is really terrifying. And it is something that is going to be shaping how we live, how companies operate, how capital is allocated, and how investors are going to be assessing risk and value. So, of course, I am a realist. I'm practical. I work in early stage VC. I do not expect startups to do or even need a full carbon reporting system overnight. But what they do need to be aware of is, how this might be useful, and also to understand the expectations of their customers and their investors. Of course, materiality is something that really matters. We should be only encouraging our portfolio companies to actually prioritize sustainability factors that are going to add to their bottom line, support their reputation or brand, or help them attract investors, employees, or customers. So carbon emissions may not be material for all of our portfolio companies now, but they will do in the future. And so what's really important for us to do is to help prepare them for that, and to help them to understand why it's important and how this information might help them either through, cost savings like we've talked about, or identify areas of risk or vulnerability, or just simply streamline procurement with their customers or due diligence with their potential investors in the future. So then it's a case of actually, okay, well, starting to measure and then manage your emissions. Like this isn't a one-stop shop. This is something that you start so you can continue to track as your company grows, as it evolves, as it goes through different sort of stages and phases, and to really think about how you interpret and act on the data. So we would probably, just so you kind of get an idea of how we would recommend carbon reporting across our portfolio and sort of at what growth stage. So we tend to take more of a staggered approach. So we would say that by Series A, we would expect companies to be able to track Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then by Series B, we would expect them to expand that to Scope 3. Particularly if it's required for customers and investors. And then beyond that, it's really about preparing for regulatory compliance. This can change very quickly. And so it's just being ready for that and to make sure that it's incorporated into sort of more strategy integration. And of course, like we know we're not trying to get our companies to spend unnecessary costs. And there are very expensive carbon reporting software out there. It's not necessary. There are ways to start with very simple kind of tracking methods. There are free tools out there. There's a number that we recommend. And so it's just kind of getting that starting point. So I'll give you an example. Antler, we started measuring our operational emissions about 3 years ago, 3+ years ago. And part of the reasoning for this was just simply to know how to do it, what it was all about, and whether we could do it. It was also just being prepared for regulatory change that will be mandatory for us at some point in the future. But it was also so we could talk to portfolio companies about this. Like, we've done this, we've experienced it. Here's what's good about it. Here's what's bad. Here's how long it's going to take you. And we could help you through that process when it's necessary, or even if you just want to get a better understanding. So I think, you know, it's being practical and it's thinking about when it's necessary, but making sure that you're prepared for when that time comes.
Yeah, and I think he's right. To your point, I think you start to lose folks when you act like it's so important for every early stage company all the time. People, then you lose trust immediately because they're like, well, it's not practical. Like, we're trying to make payroll next week, so like that's not going to work, right?
So actually, I'm gonna give a plug to you guys on this because we did. I'll be quick. So we did a benchmarking exercise with Novata. So basically, Novata, we tasked them with looking across our entire sustainability integration across, you know, our investment decision-making process and on our monitoring. And we expected them to come back and essentially say, you don't do enough around emissions and you should be asking all of your companies to give emissions data. But in fact, they came back and they said, look, you know, we like your approach of assessing climate risk across your portfolio. We do think there is more you could be doing, but we recognize that this is something that probably makes sense at a later stage. So it was more an engagement of how can we help you get the companies to the point where they're able to do this. So I really liked that approach, and hats off to Novata for that.
Appreciate that. I do feel, especially with early stage VCs, it is much more a build capacity educational exercise, especially for a lot of the portfolio companies, because not everyone is working in this space, or everyone is not as fluent. Like, you and I are practitioners and we've been talking about it, and we have all this jargon that we that we talk about, but like a lot of folks just aren't don't think about day to day. So I guess I'm curious, do you get much pushback from your companies when you start talking about this, or is it pretty well received?
So there's a couple of things that we've done. So we didn't want this to be part of every conversation. We recognize it's probably case by case. So we actually developed a climate risk model to help us be a bit more focused. So we could identify which companies had heightened climate risk, and then we could kind of dig deeper and talk to them about, okay, how might you understand what this risk might be? Should you start thinking about emissions? And it's kind of the broader scope of climate risk, but obviously very much linked to emissions like we talked about earlier. I think when you do start to talk or you lead with the message, carbon reporting, you'll lose a lot of people. So it's very much making sure that this makes sense for the company, providing the right tools if they do need to do it, and making it a really sort of, seamless process for them, and really explaining sort of the business necessity and not just talking from a regulatory standpoint. And this is, to be honest, everything related to sustainability. It's not just carbon. It's also thinking about more broader context of what sustainability is all about. It has to be something, to your point at the very beginning, does this add value to the company? Like, what difference is this going to make? Or are they just spending unnecessary money or wasting time on doing something which really isn't relevant for them at this point? But what we can do is make sure that they understand at what point in the roadmap this should be coming in, and making sure that they educate their employees, or they educate their finance team, or they just simply recognize which investors might need this information and they do their homework. And I think that's really kind of crucial to the process itself.
Yeah, 100%. I think just like being realistic, even if you're a buyout GP and your LPs are asking about this, telling your companies, hey, our LPs are asked about this. This is like table stakes now. Like having that honest conversation, I just feel like we just assume people will understand the value. But I think it takes time. I think, if we think of the different pillars, we have compliance, we have, if you're looking at LPs, you have regulation, you have risk and opportunities, you have revenue, and you have cost savings across the board. And so if you think of those individually, I think it can help with companies and getting them to the point where they, one, set a baseline, feel good about it, can take 5 minutes max based on industry, geography, revenue, that sort of thing. Or, once you get more comfortable and they're ready to take that next step, then there are plenty of tools, which we know a lot about, in terms of actually like building up that full carbon profile. So where are my hotspots, what suppliers are, where most of my emissions are. Like, do I have to talk to those suppliers? Do I have to change suppliers? Like, should I stream? Like, then we get in those conversations. It doesn't have to be that right away. And you don't expect that right away either, right? Like, I think like even generally, if folks have never tracked this before, their investors don't expect that level of sophistication right off the bat. And so
Exactly.
I think that's probably a little bit encouraging for folks as well.
Yeah. I think this is, again, the case with every sort of startup or company. Like, it's an iterative process. It does not have to be perfect from day one. Like, we're all learning, and we're all figuring out the right approach. Make it right for you. Don't be afraid to question, explore different options. You'll find the right approach that really adds value to what you do as a company, and that'll kind of serve you well going forward. This isn't just about today, it's also thinking about your growth trajectory going forward.
Yep, 100%. Looking at the time here, what I wanted to do is just throw up one more poll before we take any other questions and then wrap up. And the reason is because we're talking about carbon reporting, Carbon Navigator, right? Novata obviously builds these tools. So wanted to see for folks in the audience if they were interested in taking a look at this. You can just answer yes or no, thank you, just to give us a sense of who we should follow up with here as well. But again, this is just the first step in the tracking piece. I think the broader discussion that Ross and I were having today is like, it's beyond regulation. It's not just because I have to. There's actually real value there. And I think where we're sitting now in Singapore and Asia more broadly is really showing like how it's done, which is really cool. So I'll let folks answer this. All right. think we're good. See if, and for folks listening still, I know a bunch are going to be listening async, but if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. If not, I think we can probably do one more question, Roz, and then we can wrap up, if that works for you.
Sure, sure.
Cool. Let's see here. There's a couple good ones. Where someone. I actually kind of like this one. I was going to ask the politics one, but I told myself that I'm not going to do it. So, what are some
It's something
ways
we
to,
can't avoid.
in this case, I'm going to avoid it. What are some ways to reduce emissions moving forward as a GP or a company? And so you can take that, or I can take that, whichever you
I
prefer.
think you should take that one, Kyle.
Sure. I think like the headliners of like, we need to change to renewable energy, we need to change to LED light bulbs, like all this stuff is like, I think not really what this question is supposed to get at. I think that's important and that takes time to like, you don't control what type of energy your utility provides you. So I think that's like a tough change overall. I think you can be more mindful about if you're looking at scope 3. Business travel is an easy one. We've made decisions at Novata the past few years to streamline business travel. I think that's pretty straightforward. If you are, you can always reduce energy consumption, scope 2 emissions, electricity if you're just working out of an office. And then if you're in manufacturing or logistics, like we talked about earlier, you can actually change suppliers because there are suppliers that actively try to reduce their emissions profile. And so by changing suppliers, you're able to potentially lower your costs while reducing your emissions as well. And so that's really at a company level. At a GP level, if you're looking at your finance emissions, which is your share of the emissions that you essentially own, right? So if you own 10% of the company, you own 10% of those emissions. How do you reduce those emissions across your entire portfolio? I do think it's a company by company approach. If you're investing in technology, consumer goods, and some other industry, healthcare, you can't recommend the same thing for everyone. Healthcare is probably going to be a bit more energy intensive, and consumers probably going to be a bit more focused on your supply chain. So it's really a case by case basis, and that's really provides an opportunity for GPs to engage their companies in a different way that than they have in the past. And it might be refreshing for the company as well. You never know. Anything else to add on that point, or?
Yeah, I would say sort of what's been interesting is like more sort of talk around feed-in tariffs and then also PPAs. I think that'll be interesting to see the development going forward because that in itself just kind of propels the need for renewables. So I think that's something to kind of watch for the larger organizations. I would say that definitely from a GP standpoint, when we looked at our operational emissions, we put together what we attempted was a kind of a decarb strategy. And the first thing was, how do we approach from an office perspective, greater education, maybe there's some policies, like we made it quite a relatable policy and trying to make it a bit more relevant for individuals on the ground. Like there's a lot of talk about emissions and people don't really know what it means and how that relates to what they do on a day-to-day basis. So I think that education piece is really important for employees and then also across your portfolio companies as well. And then making sure that you're not having irrelevant conversations because as soon as that happens, people get turned off. So to that point, like make it very focused and targeted and really sort of know why you're talking to that portfolio company about carbon reporting and ensuring it makes sense for what they do.
Awesome. Looking at the time, I feel like that was like the fastest 45 minutes that ever happened. Like I can't believe it's almost over. So I think in closing, I have a couple takeaways just from our discussion, but I think if any, if folks are watching this back or if you want to take something away from this, I think the big thing for me is Don't sleep on Asia. Like I know most folks are actually are calling in and they're based in Singapore or they're based in the region, but for other folks listening in, I think that's a big headline. I think the other one is it's not just compliance and it's not just regulations. Like start having those conversations, reach out, talk to us. I'll talk to anybody at any time about this. I think it's fascinating. I think it's where the world is moving. And so I think it's a really exciting time. And I think folks like Roz really help push the conversation forward. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
And I guess anything else from you before we sign off here?
No, I think that was a great summary. I think just see it as something for business success. And that's the key takeaway.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, with that, I must thank everyone again for spending your Monday evening with us. Really appreciate it. Please reach out if you have any questions or comments. And we look forward to hearing from everyone soon. So thanks so much.